Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel. Behind the rain-streaked windows of Cedar Ridge Veterans Home, former Navy SEAL Jack Turner stood frozen beside his loyal German Shepherd Rex as he witnessed a moment no son should ever endure. His elderly father, Walter, a trembling Vietnam veteran, sat trapped in a wheelchair while the woman trusted by the entire town forced his bruised hand onto papers he was too terrified to refuse. Cold rain drifted across the mountains surrounding Asheville, North Carolina, while gray clouds hung low above the endless forests, like old memories refusing to leave. The narrow highway leading into town shimmered beneath wet headlights as a dark blue Ford F-150 rolled slowly through the evening mist. Pine trees swayed heavily in the wind beside the road, their branches whispering against one another like distant voices carried through the storm. Behind the wheel sat Jack Turner, a 48-year-old former Navy SEAL, whose broad shoulders and rigid posture still carried the shape of military discipline long after retirement. His face looked carved from stone, weathered by too many winters. Sharp cheekbones rested beneath short, dark stubble streaked faintly with gray, and a thin scar crossed the edge of his jawline near his left ear, a souvenir from a roadside explosion outside Kandahar nearly 12 years earlier. Jack had the kind of cold, blue eyes people trusted immediately, but rarely felt comfortable questioning. Years in combat had trained him to study exits before conversations, and rooftops before faces. Silence came naturally to him now. Beside him on the passenger seat sat Rex, a 9-year-old German Shepherd whose thick black and tan coat still looked powerful despite the pale silver beginning to spread around his muzzle. The dog's ears twitched constantly toward every passing sound, and his amber eyes never truly rested. Rex had served beside Jack for nearly 7 years across Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, surviving ambushes, sniper fire, and desert patrols where instinct often mattered more than orders. Unlike ordinary dogs, Rex rarely barked without reason. His calmness was what made his reactions dangerous. Jack tightened his grip slightly on the steering wheel as the phone call replayed endlessly in his mind. "Your father had a fall in the bathroom this morning, Mr. Turner. Nothing severe, but we thought you should come." The woman on the phone had sounded warm and polished, almost rehearsed. Too rehearsed. Jack had spent enough years around politicians, officers, and frightened informants to recognize when kindness sounded manufactured. He glanced briefly toward Rex. The dog remained staring through the rain-covered windshield toward the distant lights of Asheville. Jack had not been home in nearly 6 years. After his final deployment, he drifted between military contracts, private security jobs, and isolated cabins across Montana and Colorado, avoiding long conversations and even longer memories. His mother, Helen Turner, had died from cancer during one of those years overseas. Jack still remembered missing her final phone call because he had been trapped inside a convoy crossing the Syrian border. The guilt never left him. And now only Walter remained. Walter Turner had once been one of the hardest men in Buncombe County. At 82, the old Vietnam veteran still carried himself with the stubborn pride of a marine mechanic who spent decades repairing engines with grease-blackened hands. Jack remembered being 8 years old, watching his father rebuild an old Chevrolet truck in the freezing winter without gloves, cigarette smoke curling from his mouth while snow fell across the garage roof. Walter never complained about pain. Not once. Which was exactly why the phone call unsettled Jack so deeply. Cedar Ridge Veterans Home appeared through the rain near the edge of town, standing behind rows of dark cedar trees and old stone walls stained by decades of storms. Warm yellow lights glowed behind large windows, making the building appear comforting from a distance, almost peaceful. A wooden sign near the entrance displayed carved letters painted carefully in gold. Cedar Ridge Veterans Care Center, honor, dignity, family. Rex suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears stiffened sharply. Then came the growl. Low, deep, warning. Jack's eyes narrowed immediately. Easy, boy. But Rex continued staring at the building without blinking. The truck engine died softly beneath the rain while Jack stepped out into the cold evening air. Water soaked instantly into his dark jacket as he walked toward the entrance with Rex beside him. The automatic doors slid open quietly, releasing the smell of antiseptic, old carpet, reheated soup, and something else beneath it all. Something stale. Something trapped. Inside the lobby, soft piano music drifted from hidden speakers, while elderly veterans sat silently near the fireplace in wheelchairs, facing a muted television. A nurse pushed a medication cart slowly down the hallway without meeting anyone's eyes. Behind the front desk stood Linda Harper. She appeared to be in her early 50s, tall and elegantly thin, with smooth blonde hair carefully pinned behind her shoulders, and pale skin untouched by age, except for faint lines near her mouth. Her beige blazer matched the warm colors of the lobby perfectly, and a silver cross necklace rested against her throat. Everything about her looked composed, controlled, practiced. She smiled instantly the moment Jack approached. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, extending one manicured hand. "We've been expecting you." Her voice carried the calm sweetness of someone trained to comfort frightened families. Jack shook her hand once, firm, brief. Rex stepped slightly in front of him and growled louder. Linda's smile flickered almost invisibly before returning. "Well," she laughed lightly, "he certainly takes his job seriously." Jack rested one hand against Rex's neck without taking his eyes off Linda. "He usually has a reason." For half a second, silence tightened between them. Then Linda turned smoothly toward the hallway. "Walter is resting in room 214. This way." They followed her through softly lit corridors lined with framed military photographs and faded American flags. Some residents looked up briefly as Jack passed. Others quickly lowered their heads. One elderly man with trembling hands stopped speaking entirely when Linda walked near him. Jack noticed every reaction. Years of war had taught him something simple about fear. Human beings rarely spoke at first. Their bodies did. Room 214 sat near the end of the eastern hallway beside a rain-covered window overlooking the cedar trees outside. Linda opened the door carefully. Walter Turner sat near the bed in a wheelchair with a thin gray blanket across his legs. The old man looked painfully smaller than Jack remembered. His once broad shoulders had collapsed inward beneath a loose flannel shirt, and deep exhaustion darkened the skin beneath pale blue eyes that once terrified stubborn mechanics twice his size. His silver hair had thinned dramatically, and his weathered hands trembled softly against the armrest. Jack felt something twist painfully inside his chest. "Hey, Dad." Walter looked up slowly. Then came the smile. Weak, forced. The kind people used when trying not to worry someone they loved. "There he is," Walter whispered. Jack crouched beside him immediately. The old veteran's skin felt cold. Too cold. "You okay in here?" Walter answered too quickly. "I'm fine." Rex walked beside the wheelchair and gently pressed his head against Walter's knee. The old man smiled faintly while scratching behind the dog's ears with shaking fingers. "Still watching over everybody, huh, Rex?" Jack studied his father carefully. The hesitation before answers, the fear hiding behind every smile. Then he noticed bruises beneath Walter's sleeve near the wrist. Finger-shaped bruises. Old ones. Jack's stomach tightened instantly. "What happened to your arm?" Walter immediately pulled the sleeve downward. bumped into the bathroom rail. Jack stared at him silently. Walter had lied badly his entire life. Linda stepped smoothly toward the doorway. "Falls are very common at his age," she explained softly. "But we're monitoring him closely." Rex suddenly turned toward her and growled again, this time louder, more aggressive. The entire room went still. Linda's expression froze for the briefest moment before her smile returned once more. But Jack noticed it now. The coldness beneath it. The control. When visiting hours ended, Jack helped adjust Walter's blanket before stepping back into the hallway with Rex. Rain hammered harder against the windows outside while distant thunder rolled through the mountains. Then Rex stopped walking completely. His entire body stiffened. The dog stared toward a dark stairwell near the rear corridor marked Special Care Unit, authorized staff only. Several elderly residents nearby lowered their heads immediately. One old veteran in a wheelchair quietly turned away like a prisoner avoiding eye contact with guards. Rex growled again. Deep, certain, dangerous. Jack slowly followed the dog's stare toward the basement door while cold instincts he thought he buried years ago began waking inside him once more. Something inside Cedar Ridge was wrong, and Rex had just smelled it first. Cold fog rolled through Asheville for nearly 3 straight days after Jack Turner's first visit to Cedar Ridge. Rainwater dripped endlessly from cedar branches surrounding the facility, and the mountains beyond town disappeared behind thick gray clouds that made the world feel smaller, quieter, trapped beneath winter skies. Every morning, Jack drove the same narrow road toward the nursing home, while Rex sat silently beside him, watching the forests slide past the truck windows with unwavering focus. Something inside the old German shepherd had changed since arriving in Asheville. The dog no longer relaxed during car rides or slept beside the heater back at Jack's rented cabin near Black Mountain. Instead, Rex spent long hours standing near the front door with ears raised toward the darkness outside, as though waiting for danger to finally show itself. Jack trusted that instinct more than most men trusted their own judgment. Combat had taught him survival rarely came from ignoring what felt wrong. Cedar Ridge looked harmless in daylight. Elderly veterans sat near windows drinking coffee while soft jazz music drifted through the lobby speakers. Nurses smiled politely. Volunteers arranged artificial flowers near the reception desk. But now Jack noticed details he had missed before. The silence. Every conversation seemed to fade whenever Linda Harper walked through the hallways. Wheelchairs stopped moving, heads lowered. Even staff members straightened nervously around her. Linda still wore the same calm smile each day, the same elegant beige clothing and carefully styled blonde hair pinned neatly above her shoulders. Her pale skin looked almost porcelain beneath the warm lobby lights, and her voice never rose above a comforting softness that made families trust her immediately. But Jack had started recognizing something colder beneath the performance. Linda did not simply manage Cedar Ridge. She controlled it. Walter Turner sat near the dining room window wearing a faded green army sweater stretched loosely across his shrinking frame. The old veteran looked thinner every day. His once powerful mechanic's hands now trembled while lifting a spoon toward his mouth. Jack remembered those same hands rebuilding engines late into freezing nights while country music played through dusty garage speakers. Walter Turner had once frightened stubborn men twice his size with nothing more than a stare. Seeing him reduced to silence disturbed Jack far more than any battlefield memory. "You eating enough?" Jack asked quietly while sitting beside him. Walter forced a tired smile. "Food gets worse when you get old." "That's not what I asked." Walter lowered his eyes toward the untouched mashed potatoes on his tray instead of answering. Rex rested near the wheelchair but remained alert. A medication cart rolled past, pushed by a young orderly named Trevor Mills, a broad-shouldered man in his late 20s with shaved brown hair and a thick neck reddened from years of smoking. Trevor moved through the hallway with the impatient heaviness of someone angry at life long before arriving at Cedar Ridge. His father had reportedly died from opioid addiction years earlier, and bitterness seemed permanently trapped inside the man's face. Several residents flinched slightly when he approached with paper cups full of pills. One elderly woman nearly dropped hers while trying to steady her trembling fingers. Trevor sighed loudly. "Come on now, Mrs. Grayson. We've done this every night for 2 years." Mrs. Grayson apologized immediately in a frightened whisper. Jack noticed she swallowed the medication without even asking what it was. Rex growled softly beneath the table. Trevor glanced down uneasily at the dog before hurrying away. Jack's jaw tightened. "What are they giving everybody?" Walter answered too fast again. "Just medicine." "You don't sound convinced." The old veteran remained silent. Halfway through lunch, Jack noticed bruising near Walter's wrist again. Dark purple marks shaped almost perfectly like fingerprints. Old bruises layered over newer ones. Jack gently pulled the sleeve upward. Walter jerked his arm back instantly. Fear crossed the old man's face before embarrassment replaced it. "Bathroom rail," he muttered. Jack stared at him without blinking. "Dad." Walter swallowed hard. "Just let it go." The words unsettled Jack more than the bruises themselves. Walter Turner had survived Vietnam, poverty, alcoholism after the war, and the death of his wife without ever once asking anyone to let it go. Something inside Cedar Ridge had taught him fear. Later that afternoon, Jack stepped outside into the rain-covered courtyard behind the building while Rex paced beside him beneath dripping pine trees. Several elderly residents sat wrapped in blankets, watching the storm silently from beneath a covered patio. That was when Jack noticed Emily Carter for the first time. She stood near the back entrance, holding a stack of folded towels against her chest. Emily looked around 42, with soft auburn hair loosely tied behind her neck and tired green eyes shadowed by exhaustion that makeup could no longer hide. Her face carried the quiet sadness of someone who spent years surviving disappointment without allowing bitterness to destroy kindness entirely. Unlike most staff members, Emily moved gently around residents, kneeling beside wheelchairs instead of towering over them. Her pale blue scrubs hung loosely against her slender frame, and a silver wedding ring still rested around her finger despite her husband having died 3 years earlier in a highway accident during a snowstorm outside Knoxville. Loss had softened her rather than hardened her, but fear still followed her everywhere. Emily crouched beside an elderly veteran struggling to adjust his blanket. "There we go, Mr. Callahan," she whispered softly. "Better." The old man nodded gratefully. Rex immediately relaxed slightly near her. That alone caught Jack's attention. Dogs like Rex judged character faster than people did. Emily looked up and noticed Jack watching. For a brief second, nervousness crossed her face before she offered a small, tired smile. "Your dog seems smarter than most people in this building." Jack almost smiled back. "Almost." "Usually is." Emily glanced carefully toward the hallway behind her before lowering her voice. "Walter talked about you all morning. He's proud you came home." Something painful moved behind Jack's ribs. "Doesn't seem very happy here." Emily hesitated too long before answering. "Getting old is hard." Jack studied her expression carefully. She was lying. Badly. But not out of cruelty. Out of fear. Before he could speak again, a teenage boy pushed through the back door carrying a skateboard beneath one arm. He looked around 16, with messy, dark hair hanging over sharp brown eyes and a permanent restless energy that made standing still seem impossible. A silver chain hung around his neck above a wrinkled hoodie, and faint bruises marked one knuckle from recent fights. "Mom, you done yet?" he asked impatiently before noticing Jack and Rex. The boy froze instantly when he saw the German Shepherd. "Whoa, that dog's huge." Emily sighed softly. "Noah, don't stare." Noah Carter shrugged but moved closer anyway, fascinated by Rex. "Military dog?" Jack nodded once. "Former military." Noah crouched slightly near Rex. "Can I pet him?" Rex watched the teenager carefully before allowing the touch. Emily looked surprised. "He usually doesn't trust strangers that fast." Jack noticed the dark circles beneath Noah's eyes and the smell of cigarette smoke lingering faintly on his hoodie. Trouble followed boys who looked like that. He recognized it because he had once looked similar after his first deployment home. "School keeping you busy?" Jack asked. Noah laughed bitterly. "Depends who's asking." Emily's face tightened with quiet frustration. "He's been skipping classes. Only the boring ones." But before the conversation could continue, shouting suddenly echoed from inside Cedar Ridge. An elderly man stumbled into the hallway clutching the wall with trembling hands, while Trevor and another orderly hurried after him. The old veteran's white hair stuck wildly around his head, and his thin body shook beneath a hospital robe. Panic filled his watery eyes. "I said I don't want the pills tonight!" he cried. Several residents immediately lowered their heads. Trevor grabbed the man's arm roughly. "Easy now, Frank." Frank's terrified gaze landed on Jack. Then suddenly the old man lurched forward and grabbed Jack's wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them send your father downstairs," he whispered hoarsely. "People disappear down there." Before Jack could respond, Trevor pulled the old veteran backward hard enough to nearly throw him off balance. "He's confused," Trevor muttered quickly while dragging Frank toward the hallway. Frank kept staring at Jack with desperate fear until the corner swallowed him from view. Silence returned instantly afterward. Even the rain outside seemed quieter now. Rex stood completely still beside Jack, ears raised toward the basement stairwell again. Then, low and dangerous, the German Shepherd growled into the silence. Heavy rain swallowed the mountains surrounding Asheville that night, turning the narrow roads into rivers of black water beneath endless flashes of distant lightning. Wind pushed violently against the pine forests outside town, while thunder rolled across the valleys like artillery, echoing through old battlefields. Inside the small rented cabin near Black Mountain, Jack Turner sat alone at the kitchen table, beneath a dim yellow lamp, staring silently at the untouched cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. Rex lay near the front door, but the German Shepherd had not truly rested once all evening. The dog's ears twitched constantly toward the darkness outside, while low growls occasionally rumbled deep inside his chest without warning. Jack recognized the behavior immediately. Rex only acted this way before danger. The same thing had happened outside Fallujah before insurgents attacked their convoy from a collapsed apartment building. Jack rubbed one rough hand across his jaw while memories drifted through him like ghosts carried by rainwater. Frank Callahan's terrified whisper replayed endlessly inside his mind. "Don't let them send your father downstairs. People disappear down there." Every instinct inside Jack told him not to ignore that warning. At 9:17 p.m., he finally stood from the table, grabbed his dark waterproof jacket, and reached for the truck keys. Rex was already waiting beside the door before Jack spoke a word. Rain hammered the windshield during the drive toward Cedar Ridge. The facility looked entirely different at night. The warm illusion from daytime had vanished, replaced by long, dark windows and pale security lights reflecting across soaked pavement like prison floodlights. Most of the building sat in silence except for a few glowing windows near the upper floors. Jack parked near the side entrance instead of the front lobby. The former SEAL moved quietly through the storm with Rex close beside him, boots splashing through puddles beneath swaying cedar branches. Combat had taught him how buildings changed after dark. Real behavior always emerged once audiences disappeared. The side entrance door buzzed softly when a tired night receptionist finally unlocked it remotely. Inside, the hallways felt colder now, quieter. Television sounds murmured faintly from distant patient rooms, while the scent of disinfectant mixed with old carpet and stale medication drifted through the air. Rex immediately stiffened. The dog's muscles tightened beneath his thick fur as he stared toward the rear corridor near the basement stairwell. Then he pulled hard against the leash. "Rex." The German Shepherd ignored the command for the first time in months. Jack frowned instantly and followed the dog deeper into the building. Most lights had already been dimmed for nighttime hours. A few elderly veterans sat half asleep in wheelchairs facing dark television screens, while exhausted staff pushed medication carts through the halls. One nurse looked up briefly before quickly lowering her eyes once she recognized Jack. Fear again. Everywhere in this place. Near the western wing, Jack spotted Emily Carter standing beside a linen closet, organizing folded blankets with trembling hands. She looked even more exhausted than earlier that afternoon. Her auburn hair had partially fallen loose around her face, and faint tears had dried near the corners of her tired green eyes. She jumped slightly when Rex rounded the hallway corner. "Jack?" she whispered nervously. "You shouldn't be here this late." Jack studied her carefully. "Where's my father?" Emily hesitated. "Too long." "Linda moved some residents for nighttime observation." "Downstairs?" Emily's silence answered for her. Rex suddenly growled again and pulled harder toward the basement hallway. Panic flashed across Emily's face immediately. "Please," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the security cameras above the corridor. "Don't go down there tonight." Jack stepped closer. "Emily." Something inside her finally cracked. Her shoulders slumped beneath the pale blue scrubs, and exhaustion replaced the careful professionalism she had worn all day. "I tried reporting things last year," she confessed quietly. "State inspectors came for 2 hours. Linda charmed them, showed them selected rooms, and afterward she told everyone I was emotionally unstable because my mother was sick." Rain pounded harder against the windows nearby while Emily continued speaking with trembling breath. "My mom has congestive heart failure. Her medication alone costs more than I make in a month. Cedar Ridge Insurance pays for most of it." She looked down at her hands. "If I lose this job, she dies." Jack remained silent. Emily wiped quickly at her eyes before continuing. "People think fear looks dramatic. It doesn't. Most fear looks like people doing terrible things because they can't afford consequences." Before Jack could answer, Rex suddenly jerked violently toward the basement corridor. A sound had echoed faintly through the hallway beneath the storm outside. A muffled voice. Walter's voice. Jack moved instantly. The basement stairwell door stood partially open beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Water dripped slowly from pipes overhead, while the smell of bleach and damp concrete grew stronger with every step downward. The lower level looked nothing like the polished upper floors of Cedar Ridge. Here the walls were older, paint peeling near the corners, shadows stretching endlessly beneath buzzing ceiling lights. Several storage rooms lined the hallway beside an old physical therapy unit that appeared mostly abandoned. Then Jack heard Linda Harper's voice. Calm, cold, sharp as broken glass. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Walter." Jack stopped beside the doorway ahead and looked inside. Walter Turner sat trembling in a wheelchair near a metal desk, while Linda stood beside him holding a clipboard and several papers. The elegant warmth she displayed upstairs had vanished completely now. Her blonde hair remained perfectly arranged, but anger hardened her pale features into something almost unrecognizable. "You simply signed the report," she said quietly. "The bruises happened because you fell." Walter's shaking hand barely held the pen. "I already told you." Linda suddenly gripped his wrist hard enough to stop his words. Walter flinched immediately. "You are not helping yourself," she whispered. Jack's chest tightened with cold fury. Then he noticed another figure in the corner of the room. An elderly veteran sat strapped tightly into a wheelchair beneath a dim lamp. Thick restraints wrapped around both wrists and chest, while his gray head leaned forward unnaturally against his shoulders. His name tag read, Leonard Briggs. Leonard looked around 85 with deeply sunken cheeks, sparse white hair, and skin so pale it almost blended into the hospital gown hanging loosely across his thin body. Bruises darkened both wrists beneath the restraints, and drool glistened faintly near his chin from heavy sedation. Rex exploded forward with a violent bark that shook the room. Linda spun around instantly. Genuine panic crossed her face for one brief second before the mask returned. "Mr. Turner," she said smoothly, though her breathing had quickened slightly. "You startled us." Jack stepped fully into the room beside Rex. Rain thundered above the basement windows while lightning flashed across the walls. "Take your hands off my father." Linda slowly released Walter's wrist. Red pressure marks already darkened the old veteran's skin. Walter looked unable to raise his eyes anymore. Shame filled his face worse than fear. That disturbed Jack most of all. Linda folded her hands calmly in front of her beige blazer. "Leonard suffers from nighttime confusion," she explained softly. "The restraints are for his safety." Leonard suddenly lifted his head weakly. Cloudy blue eyes drifted toward Jack. "Please," he whispered hoarsely. "Don't leave us down here." Silence swallowed the room afterward, except for rain hammering the building outside. Jack looked toward his father. Walter's hands shook uncontrollably now. "Dad." Walter swallowed hard before finally whispering, "They move people down here when families stop visiting." Something cold settled permanently inside Jack's chest. Not anger anymore. Certainty. Cedar Ridge was not simply neglecting elderly veterans. It was controlling them through fear, medication, and isolation. Linda stared directly into Jack's eyes then. Her smile returned slowly, but no warmth remained inside it now, only calculation. "You don't understand what you're stepping into, Mr. Turner," she said softly. Then her pale eyes narrowed slightly toward him. "You have no idea who you're fighting, Mr. Seal." Cold rain finally gave way to freezing fog over Asheville as pale winter light crept slowly across the Blue Ridge Mountains. The forests surrounding Cedar Ridge stood silent beneath heavy clouds, while thin layers of frost covered abandoned fences and empty roads leading toward town. Morning arrived without warmth, the kind of gray southern winter morning that made even healthy people feel tired before the day fully began. Jack Turner sat inside his truck across from Cedar Ridge with both hands resting quietly on the steering wheel, while Rex watched the nursing home through the windshield without blinking. Neither of them had slept much after the basement encounter with Linda Harper. Every time Jack closed his eyes, he saw Walter sitting helpless beneath those flickering basement lights, while Leonard Briggs whispered through drugged exhaustion not to leave them there. Something inside Jack had shifted permanently after that night. This was no longer suspicion. It was war. And wars required patience before attack. Jack spent the next several days visiting Cedar Ridge at different hours without warning. Sometimes he arrived during breakfast, sometimes near midnight. He observed routines the same way he once studied enemy compounds overseas. Which nurses carried medication, which residents disappeared after complaints, which hallways grew quieter whenever Linda approached. Rex stayed beside him every visit, silent but intensely alert, his amber eyes constantly tracking movement inside the building. Jack started carrying a small military notebook in his jacket pocket again, the same waterproof green notebook he once used during deployments in Afghanistan. Names, times, medication carts, shift changes. Every detail mattered now. By the fourth day, patterns began emerging. Residents who openly complained to relatives were often transferred downstairs afterward for special observation. Several patients who seemed mentally clear during daytime suddenly appeared heavily sedated by evening. One elderly veteran vanished entirely from the dining room after arguing with Trevor Mills about medication dosages. Nobody explained where he went. Nobody asked questions. Fear controlled Cedar Ridge better than locks ever could. Walter looked weaker each visit now. The old mechanic rarely met Jack's eyes anymore, and his once stubborn voice had become cautious, almost apologetic. One afternoon, while helping his father button a flannel shirt near the window, Jack noticed Walter's hands shaking harder than before. "They increasing your meds?" Walter froze briefly before answering. "I sleep better now." "That wasn't my question." Walter looked away toward the rain-covered cedar trees outside. "You should stop digging around here, son." Jack's jaw tightened slightly. "Why?" The old veteran swallowed hard. "Because people get punished for causing trouble." Hearing those words from Walter Turner felt like watching a mountain crumble. The man who once punched a drunk customer for insulting a waitress now sounded afraid to even whisper. Rex suddenly lifted his head from beside the bed and stared toward the hallway. Low growl. Warning again. Jack stepped outside room 214 and noticed Trevor pushing a medication cart toward another wing. Beside him walked a tall, thin nurse Jack had not seen before. Her name tag read Patricia Wynn. Patricia appeared to be around 30, with sharp cheekbones, pale, freckled skin, and dark hair pulled tightly into a severe bun that made her already narrow face seem even colder. Unlike Emily, Patricia moved through the halls with detached efficiency, avoiding eye contact with residents entirely. Rumors among staff suggested she once worked at a psychiatric hospital outside Charlotte, where violent patients frequently attacked nurses. Years in that environment had hardened her emotionally, until empathy became exhaustion instead. Rex growled openly when Patricia passed. The woman stopped briefly and glanced uneasily at the dog. "That animal shouldn't be around patients," she muttered. Trevor laughed quietly. "Dog probably smarter than half the people here anyway." But Patricia did not smile. She simply continued walking. Jack noticed several elderly residents shrinking back as the medication cart approached. One old man quietly hid pills beneath his tongue before pretending to swallow. Another woman trembled visibly while Patricia checked her chart. Nobody trusted the medicine anymore. Late that evening, Jack remained near the rear courtyard after visiting hours, while Rex wandered slowly beside the cedar trees. The dog suddenly stopped near a side hallway leading toward the laundry room. His ears rose sharply. Then he pulled hard against the leash. Jack followed immediately. Cold air drifted through the narrow corridor ahead, where industrial washing machines hummed faintly behind metal doors. Then came a weak, scratching sound, Rex barked once and shoved his nose against the laundry room door. Jack opened it instantly. Freezing air rushed outward. Near the far wall sat an elderly woman wrapped only in a thin hospital blanket. Her wheelchair had partially rolled sideways beside a drain pipe, while water dripped steadily from exposed ceiling valves above her. The woman looked around 78, with wispy white hair hanging unevenly around her small, frightened face. Her pale skin had nearly turned blue from cold exposure, and confusion clouded her watery eyes. A name bracelet around her wrist read, Margaret Holloway. Margaret suffered from Alzheimer's and often wandered during nighttime hours. But terror had temporarily cut through her confusion now. "Nobody came back," she whispered weakly, while shivering violently. Jack immediately removed his jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Rex pressed his warm body gently against her legs, while the old woman clutched his fur with trembling fingers. "Easy now," Jack said softly. "You're okay." Emily appeared moments later after hearing the barking. The color drained instantly from her face when she saw Margaret. "Oh my God." She rushed forward and touched the old woman's freezing hands. "How long has she been here?" Margaret blinked slowly. "The lights turned off." Emily looked close to tears now. "Laundry rotation changed 3 hours ago." Jack stared toward the dark hallway outside. Somebody had forgotten this woman here. Or worse, left her intentionally. Back upstairs, Emily helped settle Margaret into a warm bed while Jack waited silently near the nurse station. Noah Carter eventually arrived to pick up his mother after basketball practice. The 16-year-old looked different tonight somehow, less defensive. He wore a dark hoodie beneath a denim jacket with wet hair falling messily across tired eyes. The bruises on his knuckles had started fading. The teenager froze briefly when he saw Jack sitting beside Rex. "You still here?" Jack nodded toward the dog. "Rex likes the company." Noah smirked faintly and crouched beside the German shepherd. Rex immediately rested his head against the boy's shoulder. Emily noticed it too. "He doesn't usually trust people this quickly." Noah scratched behind Rex's ears carefully. "Guess he knows I'm cooler than I look." Jack almost laughed. Almost. But while watching Noah smile beside Rex, something uncomfortable stirred quietly inside him. For years after leaving the Navy, Jack avoided attachments entirely. Friends died. Families broke. People left. Distance felt safer. Yet somehow this exhausted nurse and her troubled son had begun slipping past defenses he thought permanent. Emily approached quietly once Noah stepped outside to wait in the car. Fear lingered across her pale face again. She glanced toward the hallway before reaching inside her scrub pocket. "I shouldn't do this," she whispered. Then she pressed a small black USB drive into Jack's hand. "Security footage backups, medication records, altered reports." Jack stared down at the drive silently. Emily's green eyes trembled with fear now. "If Linda finds out..." "She won't." Emily swallowed hard. "Some residents aren't just being neglected, Jack." Her voice dropped lower. "They're being erased." Footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway nearby. Emily quickly stepped backward, fear returning instantly behind her eyes. Jack closed his hand tightly around the USB drive, while Rex rose slowly beside him, staring once more toward the basement corridor beneath Cedar Ridge. A bitter wind swept across Asheville during the first week of December, carrying dead leaves through empty streets, while freezing rain tapped softly against cabin windows across the mountains. The forests surrounding Black Mountain looked colorless now beneath pale winter skies, and long shadows stretched across the frozen hills before evening had fully arrived. Inside the small rented cabin, Jack Turner sat alone at the kitchen table with the USB drive Emily had given him, resting beside an untouched bottle of beer. Rex slept near the fireplace at first glance, but his ears twitched constantly even in rest, never fully relaxed anymore. The cabin itself smelled faintly of pine wood smoke, old leather, and wet earth carried in from Jack's boots. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, every corner of the room seemed haunted by silence. Jack finally inserted the USB into his aging laptop sometime after midnight. Security footage appeared first. Hallways, medication carts, timestamp after timestamp from Cedar Ridge. He watched nurses moving residents downstairs after family visits ended. He watched Trevor Mills pushing heavily sedated veterans toward the basement, while Linda Harper calmly signed paperwork beside the elevators. None of it shocked him anymore. Then another folder opened. Financial records, altered medical reports, sedative dosage changes approved under Linda's authorization. Jack's jaw tightened slowly as years of military discipline barely restrained the anger building inside him. Rex suddenly lifted his head and stared toward Jack. The dog knew the signs. Nightmares came more often lately. Jack rarely slept more than 2 hours at a time before memories dragged him awake again. Sometimes Afghanistan returned through burning villages. Sometimes Syria returned through screaming civilians trapped beneath collapsed buildings. But lately the nightmares had changed. Now he dreamed about Walter sitting alone in that basement, while Jack arrived too late to help. Around 2:40 a.m., exhaustion finally pulled him into uneasy sleep against the couch cushions. Rain hammered the roof overhead, while shadows flickered from dying firelight across the cabin walls. Then came the nightmare. Smoke. Thick, black smoke swallowing narrow hallways. Men coughing. Someone screaming for help beneath collapsing beams. Jack stumbled through flames, carrying a wounded teammate over his shoulder while gunfire echoed outside. Suddenly, the burning hallway transformed into Cedar Ridge. Elderly veterans sat trapped behind locked doors, calling Walter's name, while Linda Harper stood smiling through the fire. Jack tried reaching them, but the floor beneath him gave way into darkness. He jerked awake violently. Rex stood beside the couch with both front paws pressed against Jack's chest, whining softly. The German Shepherd had done this overseas countless times, waking him seconds before panic attacks spiraled completely out of control. Jack rubbed one trembling hand across his face while breathing slowly. Rex remained close beside him until the shaking stopped. "Good boy," Jack whispered hoarsely. The dog rested his heavy head against Jack's knee. For years, Rex had been the only living thing capable of pulling Jack back from war when memories became too loud. The next morning, Jack drove toward Cedar Ridge beneath dark skies threatening snow. He carried the exhaustion of another sleepless night behind his cold blue eyes. Walter sat near the window inside room 214, wearing a thick wool cardigan that hung loosely from his thinning shoulders. The old mechanic looked unusually nervous today, constantly glancing toward the hallway outside, as though expecting someone to overhear them. Rex immediately walked beside Walter's wheelchair and rested near his feet protectively. Jack closed the room door quietly before speaking. "I know about Linda." Walter's hands froze around his coffee cup. Silence stretched heavily between them. Finally, the old veteran lowered his eyes. "You shouldn't keep digging." "You said that already." Jack crouched beside him. "Why is she doing this?" Walter swallowed hard. The old man suddenly looked far older than 82. "Because I made a mistake 40 years ago." Rain tapped softly against the windows while Walter stared toward the cedar trees outside. His pale blue eyes drifted somewhere far beyond the nursing home walls. "Linda was 11 when I first met her," he said quietly. "Her father drank himself half to death every weekend. Mean drunk. One winter night, their trailer caught fire outside Henderson County." Walter's trembling hands tightened around the cup. "Most people stood outside waiting for firefighters." He paused. "I went in." Jack remained silent. He had heard pieces of this story as a child, but never details. Walter continued slowly. "Found Linda trapped in her bedroom closet. Smoke everywhere, roof collapsing." The old mechanic forced a weak laugh beneath his breath. "Damn near burned my lungs out dragging her back outside." Jack studied his father carefully. Shame filled every word now. "Afterward," Walter whispered, "she followed me everywhere for years. Called me her hero. Helen used to bring her food sometimes when her father disappeared drinking." Jack frowned slightly. "What happened?" Walter stared down at his trembling hands. "Linda grew up believing survival meant control. Her father beat weakness into that girl until she stopped seeing people as people." He swallowed hard. "When she opened Cedar Ridge years later, she said she wanted to protect forgotten veterans. At first, she meant it. And now?" Walter's voice dropped lower. "Now she thinks fear is protection." Jack leaned back silently. Everything suddenly felt more complicated and somehow even uglier. Linda Harper was not simply evil. She was broken in ways that spread damage outward onto everyone around her. "Why stay silent?" Jack finally asked. Walter looked toward the hallway instinctively before answering. "Because every time somebody complains, residents suffer afterward." The old veteran's voice cracked faintly. "Leonard Briggs refused medication last year. They locked him downstairs for 2 days." Pain moved visibly across Walter's weathered face now. "Margaret Holloway called her daughter crying one night. After that, they doubled her sedatives." He looked directly at Jack for the first time. "I thought if I kept my mouth shut, maybe they'd leave the others alone." Jack felt something heavy settle inside his chest. His father had not stayed silent out of cowardice. He stayed silent because old soldiers still protected people even after their strength disappeared. Before Jack could answer, footsteps approached outside. Walter instantly lowered his eyes again. Fear. Automatic now. Linda Harper appeared moments later carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. She looked immaculate, as always, in a cream-colored sweater and silver necklace, but today, exhaustion shadowed faint lines beneath her pale makeup. "Family conversation?" she asked smoothly. Jack stood slowly. Linda smiled politely toward Walter. "Physical therapy starts in 20 minutes. Walter nodded immediately without argument. The old mechanic looked smaller again the moment Linda entered the room. That alone filled Jack with quiet rage. Later that evening, Noah Carter unexpectedly appeared outside Jack's cabin carrying a greasy paper bag of takeout burgers and a bruised basketball beneath one arm. Snow flurries drifted through the dark woods around him, while Rex barked once before recognizing the teenager. "Mom said you probably forgot to eat again," Noah muttered awkwardly. Jack almost smiled. Almost. They sat together on the cabin porch while Rex stretched beside the doorway. Noah talked more than usual tonight. About school fights. About how his father died driving home after a double hospital shift during an ice storm. "Mom never really came back after that," Noah admitted quietly. "Not completely. Jack listened without interruption. Strange how grief always recognized itself inside other people. Around midnight, after Noah finally left, Jack returned to the laptop and opened the final folder on Emily's USB. Security footage again. Basement level. Timestamp from 11 months earlier. Jack watched silently as two orderlies restrained an elderly veteran named Samuel Grady inside a wheelchair while Patricia Wynn prepared medication nearby. Samuel looked terrified, struggling weakly while slurred words escaped his mouth. Linda stood watching calmly beside the doorway. Then Patricia injected something into the old man's arm. Within minutes, Samuel's body went limp. The room became chaotic afterward. Trevor shouted for help. Patricia backed away, pale with panic. Linda immediately grabbed paperwork from the desk. Jack stared motionless at the screen while cold horror settled through him. The timestamp continued running. Samuel Grady never moved again. The blizzard arrived over Asheville like the beginning of the end of the world. Snow fell so heavily across the Blue Ridge Mountains that roads vanished beneath white darkness within hours, and entire sections of western North Carolina disappeared under emergency weather warnings before sunset. Fierce winds slammed against houses hard enough to shake windows loose from their frames, while ice coated power lines across Buncombe County. Trees bent beneath the storm until branches snapped like rifle shots inside the frozen woods. By late evening, nearly every road leading out of Asheville had been closed. Jack Turner stood outside his cabin beneath swirling snow while Rex paced restlessly beside the truck, thick flakes collecting rapidly across the German Shepherd's dark fur. The dog had been uneasy all day, constantly staring toward town with ears raised toward sounds no human could hear. Jack trusted that instinct too much to ignore it now. His phone buzzed violently inside his jacket pocket. Emily Carter's name flashed across the screen. The moment Jack answered, he heard panic beneath the storm noise. "The heating system failed," Emily whispered quickly. Her breathing shook badly. "Backup generators aren't covering the basement level. Linda's trying to stop staff from calling emergency services." Snow whipped across Jack's face while he listened. "Why?" "Because state inspectors are already reviewing complaints. If reporters see residents freezing in here..." Her voice cracked faintly. "Jack, people are going to die tonight." The line cut briefly from weather interference before reconnecting. "Walter's gone," Emily added suddenly. "Linda moved several residents downstairs an hour ago." Every muscle inside Jack tightened instantly. "I'm coming." He hung up before Emily could answer. Rex was already waiting beside the truck door. The drive toward Cedar Ridge felt almost impossible. Snow hammered the windshield so heavily, Jack could barely see the road ahead, while abandoned vehicles lined the highways beneath flashing hazard lights. The storm swallowed sound itself. Asheville looked like a ghost town buried beneath white silence. By the time Jack finally reached Cedar Ridge, nearly half the building sat dark. Emergency backup lights glowed weakly through snow-covered windows, while wind screamed around the cedar trees surrounding the property. Several frightened staff members stood near the entrance, smoking cigarettes despite the blizzard, their faces pale beneath flashing emergency lights. One paramedic truck had become trapped sideways near the parking lot entrance after skidding across black ice. Inside the nursing home, chaos hid beneath forced calm. Elderly veterans huddled beneath blankets in wheelchairs while nurses rushed between rooms, carrying portable heaters and oxygen tanks. The warm, polished image Cedar Ridge once projected had finally cracked open. Linda Harper stood near the lobby, issuing orders with rigid control, despite the fear spreading through the building. She still looked unnaturally composed in a dark gray wool coat over cream-colored clothing, though exhaustion hollowed the skin beneath her pale eyes now. Keep residents upstairs calm, she ordered sharply toward Trevor Mills. No unnecessary phone calls to families. Trevor looked shaken for the first time since Jack met him. Sweat dampened the collar of his uniform despite the cold building. The basement pipes froze, he muttered nervously. Some rooms are already below 50 degrees. Linda's voice hardened instantly. Then move space heaters downstairs. Jack stepped through the entrance covered in snow with Rex beside him. Several residents visibly relaxed the moment they saw him. Linda's expression tightened almost invisibly. You shouldn't be driving in this weather. Jack ignored her entirely. Where's my father? Linda folded her arms slowly. Residents are secure. Rex suddenly barked violently toward the rear hallway. The sound echoed through the lobby hard enough to silence everyone nearby. Jack followed the dog immediately. Emily appeared near the nurse station moments later, carrying oxygen tubing across both arms. Her auburn hair had come completely loose from its knot, and exhaustion hollowed her face beneath sleepless green eyes. 3 residents already have hypothermia symptoms, she whispered while walking beside Jack. And the basement heater completely died 40 minutes ago. Walter? Emily hesitated briefly. Linda moved him downstairs with Leonard Briggs and 2 others. Jack stopped walking. Why? Emily looked toward the cameras nervously. Because the upstairs rooms are for residents with active families. The others... She swallowed hard. The others get hidden. Rage moved coldly through Jack's chest now. Not explosive rage. Controlled rage. The kind that made Navy SEALs dangerous. Before they reached the basement corridor, Noah Carter appeared, carrying a heavy, portable oxygen tank nearly half his size through the hallway. Snow soaked his denim jacket completely, while his face flushed red from cold and exhaustion. Mom needs another regulator downstairs, he panted. Emily looked stunned. Noah, you should be home. Roads are closed. The teenager shrugged breathlessly. Besides, these old guys need help more than I do. Jack studied the boy carefully. Something had changed inside Noah. The reckless anger he carried weeks earlier seemed quieter now, replaced by purpose. Rex walked beside him briefly, nudging Noah's hand once with approval. The teenager grinned tiredly. Pretty sure your dog respects me now. Jack almost smiled again. Almost. They moved together through the freezing lower hallway, carrying heaters, blankets, and oxygen tanks toward isolated basement rooms. Pipes rattled violently overhead, while cold air drifted through cracked walls beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Several elderly veterans sat shivering beneath thin blankets inside temporary storage areas converted into overflow rooms. One old man coughed so violently, Emily had to stop and steady his oxygen mask herself. His name was Earl Simmons, an 80-year-old Korean War veteran with deeply wrinkled dark skin and clouded brown eyes weakened by emphysema. Earl still apologized repeatedly for being trouble while barely able to breathe. Years of poverty after returning from war had trained him to believe survival itself burdened other people. You're not trouble, Emily whispered gently while adjusting his blanket. You're cold. Upstairs, wind suddenly slammed hard against the building. The power flickered once. Then darkness swallowed half the basement corridor entirely. Someone screamed nearby. Noah immediately grabbed a flashlight from the supply cart and ran toward the sound without hesitation. Emily stared after him with visible fear. He used to run from responsibility, she whispered quietly. Jack looked toward the teenager disappearing into darkness, carrying emergency supplies through the freezing hall. Not anymore. Then Rex stopped moving completely. The German Shepherd's body stiffened beside the far corridor near the locked maintenance wing. Snowmelt dripped slowly from pipes overhead, while cold air pushed through the darkness ahead like breath from an open grave. Rex growled low and dangerous before lunging toward a steel door Jack had never seen opened before. "Rex?" The dog barked violently now, claws scratching against the metal. Jack noticed frost coating the bottom edges of the door. No heat beyond it. Emily's face drained pale immediately. "That hallway was supposed to be closed years ago." Jack grabbed the handle and forced the swollen metal door open against the frozen hinges. A blast of icy air rushed outward instantly. Darkness stretched through the abandoned lower wing beyond. Then came the sound. Weak coughing. Human coughing. Jack raised the flashlight slowly. Walter Turner sat wrapped in thin blankets beside Leonard Briggs and two other elderly veterans inside a freezing storage room barely warmer than the outside storm. Frost covered the walls around them while portable heaters nearby sat unplugged. Walter looked up weakly toward his son through trembling exhaustion. Rex rushed forward immediately, barking furiously into the freezing darkness. The storm finally loosened its grip over Asheville 3 days later, leaving the mountains buried beneath thick white silence and broken trees scattered across frozen roads like battlefield wreckage after retreat. Cedar Ridge stood beneath pale winter sunlight, looking older now, smaller somehow, stripped of the illusion it once carried. Snow still covered the parking lot in uneven drifts, while emergency generators hummed constantly beside the building. Families had started arriving again after roads reopened, and fear spread quietly through the nursing home faster than any official statement could contain. Rumors moved from room to room, from nurses to visitors, from frightened veterans to worried relatives standing near vending machines and half-empty coffee cups. Something terrible had happened inside Cedar Ridge during the storm. People knew it even before hearing details. Jack Turner slept less than 2 hours each night now. Dark circles shadowed his cold blue eyes, while exhaustion carved deeper lines into his weathered face. Yet beneath the fatigue burned something stronger than anger. Purpose. For the first time since leaving the Navy, Jack no longer felt like a man drifting through survival one empty day at a time. He had a target now, and men like Jack became dangerous when they finally stopped running from themselves. Inside the small cabin near Black Mountain, the kitchen table had transformed into a war room. Printed medical records covered the surface beside security photographs, medication logs, handwritten notes, and copied files from Emily's USB drive. Rex lay beneath the table watching every movement with alert amber eyes, while snowlight filtered weakly through the windows behind him. Emily sat across from Jack wearing an oversized gray sweater over faded jeans, exhaustion still lingering across her pale face after the storm. Her auburn hair remained loosely tied back, though sleepless nights and constant stress had stolen much of the softness from her features. She looked frightened still, but fear no longer completely controlled her. Noah sat nearby cleaning mud from his sneakers while occasionally glancing toward the growing mountain of evidence spread across the table. The teenager looked older lately, more focused, less angry at the world. "You really think people will listen?" Noah asked quietly. Jack studied a photograph showing bruises on Leonard Briggs's wrists. "They'll have to." Emily swallowed nervously. "Linda's connected to half the town council. Connections don't erase dead people." Silence settled heavily afterward. Outside, wind moved softly through frozen cedar branches, while Rex suddenly lifted his head toward the sound of approaching tires. Moments later, another truck stopped outside the cabin. A tall, older man stepped carefully onto the snowy porch, carrying a leather briefcase beneath one arm. Harold Bennett looked around 68, with broad shoulders beginning to stoop from age and thick silver hair combed carefully away from a deeply lined face. His dark wool coat hung neatly over a pressed-button shirt despite the storm damage surrounding Asheville. Harold had served as chairman of the Cedar Ridge Advisory Board for nearly 10 years. Before retirement, he spent decades as a local attorney defending veterans and low-income families across western North Carolina. The death of his younger brother during Vietnam had shaped nearly every major decision of his life afterward. Harold entered the cabin slowly, removing snow-covered gloves while his tired brown eyes drifted across the evidence covering Jack's table. "Emily told me enough to know this couldn't wait," he said quietly. Jack handed him the video footage showing Samuel Grady's death. Harold watched silently from beginning to end without speaking once. By the time the recording stopped, something inside the old lawyer's face had hardened permanently. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Emily looked down at her hands. "There's more." For nearly 2 hours, Jack and Emily explained everything. The basement isolation rooms, altered medication reports, patients punished after complaining to families. Harold listened carefully while taking handwritten notes inside a worn leather notebook. The deeper the story became, the paler his face looked. Finally, he closed the notebook slowly. "The city council's holding an emergency meeting tomorrow morning about the storm response." He looked directly at Jack. "Bring everything." Snow melted slowly from rooftops across Asheville the next morning, while reporters gathered outside City Hall beside local families demanding answers about Cedar Ridge. News of the basement wing had already leaked through staff members and frightened residents. Cameras lined the entrance beneath bright winter sunlight, reflecting harshly across frozen streets. Inside the council chamber, tension filled the air long before the meeting began. Elderly veterans sat beside relatives clutching printed photographs and medical paperwork, while nurses whispered nervously near the back rows. Linda Harper entered last. She wore a dark navy business suit with pearl earrings and perfectly styled blonde hair untouched by the chaos surrounding her. Only the faint exhaustion beneath her pale makeup hinted at pressure finally cracking the calm mask she carried for years. When her eyes met Jack's across the room, hatred flashed there briefly before disappearing behind practiced professionalism. Harold Bennett opened the hearing quietly. "Due to serious allegations involving Cedar Ridge Veterans Care Center, this emergency session has been authorized for immediate review." Jack stood first. Every pair of eyes followed him as he approached the projector screen, carrying a folder thick with evidence. Years of military operations had taught him how to remain calm under pressure, but this felt different somehow. More personal, more dangerous. 3 weeks ago, Jack began quietly. "I brought my father to Cedar Ridge believing he would be protected there." Silence spread through the chamber. Then the footage began. Basement rooms, bruised wrists, sedation records. Leonard Briggs restrained in a wheelchair. Samuel Grady collapsing after the injection. Gasps echoed through the room as residents' families stared in horror. Linda rose abruptly. "This man suffers from severe combat trauma," she snapped sharply. "He's manipulating isolated incidents to fuel paranoid delusions." Several council members exchanged uncertain glances. Linda stepped forward confidently now, her polished voice growing stronger. "Mr. Turner spent decades in war zones. He sees enemies everywhere." Jack said nothing. Instead, Emily Carter slowly stood from the back row. Fear trembled visibly through her body as every eye turned toward her. Yet she kept walking forward anyway. "She's lying," Emily whispered at first. Then louder. "I watched them sedate residents for convenience. I watched reports get altered." Her green eyes filled with tears.
I stayed silent because I was afraid. Other staff members began rising one by one afterward. Patricia Wynn stood shakily near the rear wall. Trevor Mills lowered his head before finally speaking. The basement wing should have been closed years ago. Even some nurses Linda trusted most now looked unable to defend her anymore. Fear had finally cracked open into guilt. Then something unexpected happened. Walter Turner slowly stood from his wheelchair near the front row, using an old Marine Corps cane beside his chair. The room instantly fell silent.
Walter's hands shook badly while he pushed himself upright, but pride still burned faintly inside his pale blue eyes. Jack instinctively stepped forward to help, but Walter lifted one trembling hand slightly. No. The old veteran wanted to stand on his own. Walter looked slowly across the chamber filled with frightened families, exhausted nurses, and elderly men who once survived wars, only to end up forgotten inside Cedar Ridge. "Getting old," Walter said quietly, "doesn't mean surrendering your dignity." His voice cracked slightly but remained steady. "We fought our whole lives to be treated like human beings." Tears filled several faces around the room now. Walter tightened both hands around the cane. "Being weak does not make us worthless." Complete silence followed afterward. Linda looked around the chamber, realizing control had finally slipped away forever. The police officers waiting near the rear doors stepped forward moments later. Linda's calm mask shattered completely for the first time.
"You people have no idea what I sacrificed for this place," she whispered angrily while officers guided her toward the exit. But nobody answered. Residents watched silently as Linda Harper was led through the council chamber doors beneath flashing reporter cameras and stunned winter sunlight outside. Rex sat quietly beside Walter's wheelchair during the entire moment, his amber eyes never leaving Linda until she disappeared from sight.
Winter settled gently over Lake Junaluska after the storm finally passed, leaving the mountains wrapped beneath soft, white snow and long ribbons of fog drifting above the frozen water each morning. The world felt quieter now, as though Asheville itself had exhaled after weeks of holding fear inside its lungs. Sunlight reflected across the icy lake in pale silver streaks, while smoke curled slowly from chimneys scattered along the shoreline. The old Turner cabin stood near the edge of the water, surrounded by cedar trees and weathered stone fences buried halfway beneath snowdrifts. Time had aged the place harshly. The wooden porch sagged slightly near one corner, several windows rattled during strong wind, and years of neglect had darkened the pine walls with moisture stains and old smoke. Yet something about the cabin still carried warmth beneath the damage, the stubborn warmth of a place that once held family together before war and grief slowly pulled everyone apart. Jack Turner spent the first 3 days rebuilding the house almost without sleep. The former Navy SEAL worked silently from sunrise until long after dark, hammering support rails into bathroom walls, widening narrow door frames for Walter's wheelchair, and constructing a sturdy wooden ramp leading toward the snowy front porch. His hands bled twice from splintered boards and frozen tools, but he never slowed down. Years in combat zones had trained Jack to repair what was broken because sometimes fixing physical things felt easier than repairing people. Rex followed him constantly through every room like a silent shadow. The German Shepherd seemed calmer here beside the lake than anywhere else since returning from the Middle East. The tension that had haunted the dog inside Cedar Ridge slowly faded day by day. His thick black and tan coat gleamed warmly beside the fireplace each evening, while silver frost gathered gently around the edges of his muzzle. Yet every night, without fail, Rex still slept directly outside Walter's bedroom door, like a soldier standing watch beside someone too important to lose. Walter Turner arrived at the cabin 4 days after Linda Harper's arrest.
Snowflakes drifted lazily through the afternoon sky, while Jack carefully helped his father out of the truck beneath the cedar trees. The old mechanic looked fragile, wrapped inside a thick wool coat and navy scarf, but something inside his pale blue eyes had changed since leaving Cedar Ridge. Fear no longer lived there constantly. Exhaustion remained. Sadness remained. But fear had begun loosening its grip. Walter stared silently across the frozen lake for nearly a full minute before speaking. "Your mother always wanted this place fixed up again." Jack glanced toward the weathered cabin. "Guess I'm late by about 20 years. Walter laughed softly beneath his breath. The sound surprised both of them.
Inside the cabin, warmth from the stone fireplace spread slowly through the old wooden rooms, while Rex guided Walter carefully from room to room, as though inspecting security himself. Every time Walter struggled with balance near the hallway, Rex immediately pressed his large body gently against the old veteran's legs to steady him. "Dog's still babysitting people," Walter muttered fondly while scratching behind Rex's ears. The German Shepherd responded with a quiet huff before lying directly beside Walter's chair. The first weeks felt awkward sometimes. Walter apologized constantly for needing help carrying blankets, climbing stairs, or standing too quickly near the kitchen table. Years of pride made dependence painful for him. Jack rarely answered those apologies directly. He simply adjusted pillows, fixed meals, chopped firewood, and continued rebuilding the cabin one board at a time. Some wounds healed better through actions than conversations. Emily, Carter, and Noah began visiting almost every weekend after Cedar Ridge officially shut down under state investigation. Emily usually arrived carrying homemade soup, extra blankets, or groceries she insisted were too much for just 2 people anyway. Her face looked softer now without constant fear shadowing her green eyes. The dark exhaustion beneath her features had not disappeared completely, but safety slowly changed people in small, invisible ways. Her auburn hair no longer stayed tied tightly every hour of the day, and sometimes Jack even caught brief flashes of humor returning to her smile again. Noah adapted to the lake cabin faster than anyone expected. The teenager spent hours outside helping Jack repair fences or splitting firewood badly enough to nearly injure himself twice the first afternoon. "You hold the axe like you're trying to intimidate it," Jack muttered while correcting Noah's grip. Noah rolled his eyes dramatically. "I grew up with Wi-Fi and microwaves, man." But beneath the sarcasm, the boy genuinely tried. More importantly, he listened. One cold Saturday morning, Jack finally began teaching Noah simple canine handling commands beside the frozen lakeshore while Rex watched patiently through drifting snow. "Military dogs don't respond to fear," Jack explained calmly. "They respond to trust." Noah nodded seriously while practicing commands with growing confidence. Rex seemed to understand the teenager needed patience more than discipline. By the end of the afternoon, the German Shepherd obeyed Noah well enough to retrieve training markers buried beneath snowbanks near the water. The boy's grin afterward looked younger than 16 for the first time in years. "Okay," Noah admitted breathlessly while scratching Rex's neck. "That was actually awesome." Walter spent more time outdoors once his strength slowly returned. Some mornings he sat beside the lake, wrapped in heavy blankets, watching sunlight rise across the mountains, while Rex rested nearby in the snow. Other afternoons he disappeared quietly into the garage, carrying old boxes filled with rusted tools and forgotten machine parts. One evening, Jack walked inside and found Walter hunched over an ancient military field radio spread across the workbench beneath hanging light bulbs. The old veteran's weathered hands still trembled slightly, but concentration sharpened his face again in familiar ways. "Thought that thing stopped working in the 70s, Jack said. Walter adjusted a loose wire carefully.
It's because you don't know how to fix things properly. Jack almost smiled. Almost. Repairing the radio became Walter's quiet mission through winter. The old mechanic spent hours polishing cracked dials, reconnecting damaged wiring, and muttering frustrated complaints whenever his shaking hands slipped.
Yet every day he looked stronger afterward. Purpose returned to people slowly, like warmth returning to frozen ground after hard winter. Late one afternoon, Emily stayed behind after Noah wandered outside with Rex toward the lake. Snow drifted softly across the porch railings, while orange firelight flickered against the cabin walls. Emily stood beside the kitchen counter, quietly watching Jack repair a loose cabinet hinge.
"You know," she said softly, "Noah talks about you constantly now." Jack kept working without looking up. "That good or bad?" Emily smiled faintly. "Depends how you feel about becoming somebody's role model." Silence lingered comfortably afterward, different from the heavy silence both of them carried months earlier. Emily eventually stepped closer beside him near the workbench. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack frowned slightly. "For what?" Her tired green eyes met his. "For giving us somewhere that finally feels safe." Jack did not know how to answer that.
Men like him understood rescue better than tenderness. Yet standing there beside Emily while snow fell softly outside the cabin windows, he realized something uncomfortable and strangely warm at the same time. He no longer felt entirely alone. That realization frightened him more than combat ever had. Near sunset the following evening, Walter sat bundled beneath thick blankets near the porch, while Jack carried sandwiches outside after hours of repairing frozen pipes beneath the cabin. Rex rested nearby, watching snowflakes drift across the lake. The world looked peaceful for once. Then suddenly the German shepherd lunged upward, snatched Jack's sandwich directly from his hand, and sprinted wildly across the snowy yard before anyone reacted. "You traitor!" Jack shouted instinctively while chasing after the dog through deep snowbanks. Rex bounded away proudly with the sandwich hanging sideways from his mouth, while Noah nearly collapsed laughing near the porch steps. And then something happened none of them expected. Walter Turner threw his head back and laughed. Not a small chuckle, not forced politeness. A real, deep laugh that echoed across the frozen lake beneath the falling snow like a sound returning home after years of silence. Rex stopped running briefly and barked happily into the winter air as Walter continued laughing beside the porch firelight. The first signs of spring arrived quietly over Lake Junaluska. Snow still rested in pale patches beneath cedar trees along the mountainside, but warmer wind had begun moving across the water again, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine instead of ice and silence. The frozen lake slowly cracked apart beneath soft morning sunlight, while birds returned to the shoreline after months hidden from winter storms. Asheville looked different now too, lighter somehow, like a town waking after surviving a long illness. Cedar Ridge no longer existed the way people remembered it. State investigators officially shut the facility down before March ended, and reporters continued uncovering years of negligence buried beneath falsified reports and manipulated inspections. Families removed loved ones from the building almost immediately after the hearings. Some elderly veterans moved in with relatives for the first time in years. Others transferred to nearby care facilities, where staff members still remembered how to treat people with dignity instead of fear. The old Cedar Ridge sign had already been removed from the entrance road, leaving only empty holes in frozen ground where the wooden posts once stood. Jack Turner drove past the property only once after the closure. The building looked abandoned beneath cloudy skies, its dark windows reflecting nothing back anymore. He never stopped the truck. Some places deserved silence more than memory. Life near the lake settled into slower rhythms as spring approached. Walter Turner looked stronger every week now. Color slowly returned to the old mechanic's face, and the trembling in his hands lessened enough for him to hold tools properly again. Most mornings he sat near the porch drinking black coffee while repairing old fishing reels or polishing rusted military equipment pulled from dusty garage boxes. The field radio he repaired during winter now worked perfectly. Soft country music often drifted through the cabin, while Walter muttered quietly about modern songs ruining civilization. Jack pretended not to laugh whenever he heard it. Rex changed too. The constant tension inside the German Shepherd finally disappeared completely after leaving Cedar Ridge behind. The dog spent long afternoons stretched beside the lake watching Noah practice training drills across the yard, occasionally barking once whenever the teenager made mistakes. Noah Carter visited almost daily now after school. The angry restlessness that once followed him everywhere had faded into something steadier. Purpose gave young men different posture, different eyes. He no longer smelled like cigarettes or hung around older boys causing trouble near Asheville gas stations. Instead, Noah spent weekends helping Jack repair boats for elderly neighbors around the lake or volunteering at local veteran events with Emily. One afternoon near the beginning of April, Noah arrived carrying official ROTC paperwork beneath one arm while Rex trotted excitedly beside him through the muddy yard. "You actually doing it?" Jack asked from beneath the truck hood while replacing an old engine belt. Noah nodded nervously. The teenager looked taller lately, his shoulders beginning to straighten beneath hard-earned confidence instead of defensive anger. "I want to help people someday." He glanced toward Rex. "Maybe military canine handling eventually." Jack studied him carefully for a moment. "You understand it's not about looking tough, right?" Noah smirked faintly. "Good thing I already learned that from you." Jack shook his head quietly while hiding the small smile threatening to appear. Emily arrived shortly afterward carrying 2 grocery bags and wearing light denim overalls beneath a cream-colored sweater. Spring sunlight softened her pale skin warmly, while loose auburn hair moved gently in the wind around her shoulders. She looked younger lately, without fear hollowing her expression constantly. Tired still, yes. Life had marked her too deeply for complete innocence to ever return. But hope had begun replacing survival inside her eyes. That changed people. "I brought lunch before you two accidentally destroy another engine," she called while walking toward the porch. Walter emerged from the cabin holding his cane beneath one arm and immediately frowned toward Noah. "Boy still swings a hammer like he's fighting raccoons." Noah groaned dramatically. "You say that every single weekend." "Because every single weekend it stays true." The old mechanic's voice carried warmth now when teasing people. That alone felt miraculous some days. Later that afternoon, Emily sat beside Jack on the porch steps while Walter and Noah prepared fishing poles near the dock below. Rex rested between them, with his head stretched lazily across Jack's boots. "I got accepted," Emily said quietly after several minutes. Jack glanced toward her. "Accepted where?" She smiled faintly. "Nursing management program at Asheville Community College." Pride mixed with nervousness inside her voice. "Night classes start this summer." Jack nodded once. "You'll be good at it." Emily looked down at her hands briefly. "I spent so many years just trying to survive. Feels strange planning a future again." Wind moved softly through the trees around them while children laughed somewhere across the lake. Jack understood that feeling better than most people ever could. War trained people to live moment by moment. Survival left little room for tomorrow. "Future's uncomfortable at first," he admitted quietly. Emily smiled toward him then. Real smile this time.
You're getting surprisingly wise in your old age, Seal. Jack snorted softly beneath his breath.
Don't spread rumors.
Across town, major changes continued unfolding after Cedar Ridge's closure. Harold Bennett worked closely with local veterans groups to reopen the property under completely new management, funded partly through state oversight and private donations. This time, former Marines, Army medics, and retired military nurses would run the facility instead of corporate administrators disconnected from the people inside it. The new name chosen for the building reflected that promise clearly: Blue Ridge Veterans Haven. Several local newspapers asked Jack repeatedly to join the leadership board because of his role exposing Cedar Ridge. Reporters framed him as a hometown hero now, though the attention made him deeply uncomfortable. One cloudy afternoon, Harold personally drove out to the lake cabin carrying official paperwork and a polished leather folder beneath his arm.
The older man looked healthier than during the investigation months earlier, though grief still lingered quietly behind his thoughtful brown eyes whenever veterans were mentioned. "The board wants you involved," Harold explained while sitting beside the porch railing. "Residents trust you." Jack stared toward the lake silently for several seconds before answering. "I'm not the right man for office meetings and fundraising dinners." Harold smiled knowingly. "You'd rather repair broken docks and chase wrecks through the woods." "Pretty much." Harold studied him carefully. "You know, helping people doesn't always require uniforms anymore." Jack looked toward Walter down by the shoreline, teaching Noah how to untangle fishing lines without swearing at them. Rex barked impatiently beside the dock while birds circled low above the water. Peace. Real peace. Not the temporary kind soldiers pretended to feel between deployments. "I spent 20 years following orders," Jack said quietly. "Think I'd rather help people my own way now." Harold nodded once. "Fair enough." Before leaving, the old lawyer placed one hand firmly against Jack's shoulder. "For what it's worth," he said softly, "this town needed somebody willing to stand up." Evening settled gently over Lake Junaluska later that night, while orange sunset reflected across the water like melted fire. Walter sat beside the dock, wrapped in an old Marine Corps jacket, while Jack repaired a lantern nearby. The old mechanic watched his son silently for several minutes before finally speaking. "You know," Walter said quietly, "I kept thinking Cedar Ridge was where life ended." Jack looked up. Walter's pale blue eyes drifted toward the darkening lake. "Then you showed me I was wrong." The old veteran slowly placed one weathered hand against Jack's shoulder. His grip still trembled slightly from age, but strength had returned beneath it now. "You didn't just save me, son." His voice softened. "You saved people the world already forgot." Jack lowered his eyes quietly afterward, because some words carried too much weight to answer immediately. Nearby, Rex rested his head across Noah's boots while spring wind moved gently through the cedar trees above the lake. Summer returned softly to Lake Junaluska 1 year after Cedar Ridge closed forever. Warm wind moved through the cedar trees surrounding the shoreline, while golden evening light shimmered gently across the water like scattered lanterns floating beneath the mountains. Fireflies drifted through tall grass near the old Turner cabin, and the smell of grilled food and pine smoke mixed together beneath the fading sunset. The lake no longer felt lonely the way it once had during those frozen winter nights when silence wrapped itself around the cabin like grief refusing to leave. Tonight the place felt alive. Laughter carried across the shoreline from folding chairs arranged near the dock, while old country songs played quietly through Walter Turner's repaired military radio sitting proudly beside the porch steps.
Jack Turner stood near the grill wearing a dark green flannel shirt with sleeves rolled above weathered forearms marked by old scars and faded tattoos from his Navy years. Time had not softened his sharp features or the cold alertness behind his blue eyes, but something inside him looked calmer now. The constant tension that once lived beneath his movements had faded little by little over the past year. He still woke from nightmares some nights. War did not disappear simply because life became kinder afterward. But now, when darkness dragged him awake, sweating and breathless, he no longer sat alone beside silent walls, waiting for sunrise. Rex always appeared first, pressing his heavy body against Jack's legs until the shaking eased. And sometimes Emily quietly crossed the hallway afterward, carrying coffee without asking questions. Healing rarely arrived dramatically. More often, it looked like people staying when old pain returned. Nearly 20 former residents from Cedar Ridge gathered beside the lake that evening, along with family members, volunteers, and several veterans from Asheville who helped rebuild Blue Ridge Veterans Haven over the past year. Some elderly men sat wrapped in blankets despite the warm weather, while others played cards beside lanterns hanging from cedar branches. Leonard Briggs rested comfortably in a padded chair near the fire pit now, healthier than anyone believed possible 12 months earlier. The deep bruises and hollow fear once trapped inside his face had slowly disappeared through proper care and patience. His white hair remained thin and uneven, but life had returned to his cloudy blue eyes again. Nearby, Earl Simmons argued loudly with another Korean War veteran about baseball teams, while children chased fireflies through the grass around them. For the first time in years, nobody looked afraid. Walter Turner walked slowly across the dock with his old Marine Corps cane tapping gently against wooden boards, while Rex stayed faithfully beside him. At 83, Walter still moved carefully, but strength had returned to his posture little by little through long months beside the lake. His silver hair glowed beneath the sunset, while laughter lines deepened around his eyes every time Noah said something ridiculous nearby. The old mechanic no longer looked like a man waiting quietly for life to end. He looked like someone finally living again. Noah Carter stood near the water teaching 2 younger boys basic dog commands using Rex as patient demonstration. The teenager had changed more than anyone over the past year. His shoulders broadened through ROTC training, and discipline slowly replaced the anger that once shaped his entire personality. He still wore messy dark hair and occasionally sarcastic expressions, but confidence had settled inside him differently now. Stronger, healthier. A faded ROTC sweatshirt hung loosely beneath his denim jacket, while Rex obeyed each command with exaggerated seriousness that made the younger boys laugh uncontrollably. "You gotta speak calm," Noah explained while adjusting one child's hand signal. "Dogs know when people fake confidence." Jack watched quietly from the grill, pride moving silently through him in ways he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Emily appeared beside him carrying lemonade in a glass pitcher. Warm sunset reflected softly through her auburn hair, while a pale summer dress moved gently around her legs in the evening wind. She looked happier now than Jack had ever seen her. The exhaustion that once haunted her green eyes had mostly faded after graduating from her nursing management program earlier that spring. She now worked at Blue Ridge Veterans Haven, helping oversee resident care with the same quiet compassion that first caught Jack's attention at Cedar Ridge. But unlike before, she no longer carried fear behind every smile. "You're staring again," she teased softly while pouring lemonade beside him. Jack blinked slightly. "At what?" Emily smiled knowingly toward Noah and Rex near the shoreline. "Your family." The word hit Jack harder than expected.
Family. For years after leaving the Navy, he convinced himself isolation kept people safe. Friends died. Marriages collapsed. Soldiers carried ghosts home inside them, and Jack believed letting anyone close only guaranteed future pain. Yet somehow, this small group beside the lake had broken through defenses he thought permanent. Walter noticed it too. The old mechanic sat quietly watching Jack and Emily together, while soft country music drifted through the warm night air. At one point, Noah accidentally dropped an entire tray of hamburger buns directly into the grass beside the fire pit. Rex lunged toward them instantly like a wolf discovering treasure. "Rex!" Noah shouted. But the German shepherd proudly grabbed 3 buns at once and sprinted wildly across the shoreline while children screamed, laughing behind him. Walter nearly choked from laughing so hard. "That damn dog still steals food like he's stationed overseas," the old veteran wheezed between laughs. Jack chased after Rex briefly through the grass before finally giving up, while everyone around the fire pit continued laughing. Strange how joy sounded after surviving so much silence. Later that evening, lanterns glowed softly around the shoreline, while stars slowly emerged above the mountains. Some veterans shared old war stories beside the fire, while others simply sat quietly listening to crickets and water moving gently against the dock. No television noise, no hospital alarms, no locked basement doors. Just people existing together without fear. Harold Bennett eventually arrived carrying homemade peach pie beneath one arm and wearing his usual dark suspenders despite the summer heat. The older lawyer looked healthier too lately. Retirement and purpose suited him better than endless city meetings ever had. "Looks like you built something important out here," Harold said quietly, while standing beside Jack near the porch railing. Jack glanced toward the fire pit where Walter sat surrounded by laughing veterans and restless children. "Wasn't really me." Harold smiled faintly. "That's usually how real things get built." Nearby, Emily rested one hand gently against Jack's arm while watching Noah teach another child how to throw a tennis ball for Rex properly. The contact felt natural now instead of frightening. Jack realized he no longer counted exits automatically every time entering crowded rooms. He no longer woke expecting disaster each morning. The scars remained. They always would. But scars no longer defined every piece of him. Sunset finally faded completely into deep blue evening while lantern light reflected across the lake like scattered stars floating on water. Walter sat quietly near the dock beside Rex, who rested his large head across Jack's boots while the former SEAL stared peacefully across the darkening shoreline. For several minutes, the old mechanic said nothing. Then softly, almost like a prayer carried by summer wind, Walter looked toward the German shepherd beside his son and whispered, "Maybe God sends dogs into this world to remind people how to love each other again." Silence followed afterward. Gentle, warm, the kind that no longer felt empty. And somewhere across Lake Junaluska, distant lights shimmered quietly against the water, while laughter continued rising into the summer night. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder from the sky or grand signs the world can easily recognize. Sometimes God sends them quietly into broken homes, lonely hearts, and forgotten lives, through the loyalty of a dog, the courage of a son, or the kindness of people who refuse to walk away when others suffer in silence. This story reminds us that no one becomes worthless simply because they grow old, become weak, or need help. In our everyday lives, there are fathers, mothers, veterans, neighbors, and lonely souls carrying pain behind closed doors while the world moves too fast to notice them. But even the smallest act of compassion can become an answer to someone's prayer. Sometimes all the person truly needs is one hand reaching back for them before darkness fully closes in. Jack, Walter, Emily, Noah, and Rex all found healing not because life suddenly became perfect, but because they finally stopped fighting alone. And maybe that is one of God's greatest lessons for us, that love, loyalty, and mercy still have the power to rebuild people long after life has tried to break them apart. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with someone who may need hope. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from or which part of this journey moved you the most. And subscribe to the channel for more stories about faith, family, courage, second chances, and the quiet miracles that still exist in this world. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, bring peace into your home, and place light into your heart, even during the darkest seasons of life.